Listen, so welcome everyone. So I've dropped this in. I will try and set these up as sort of regular calls based on team size. We can, I think for now we can handle EMEA Americas, which would be around this sort of time-ish, and we can have one earlier in the day for an APAC EMEA overlap. As the team grows, Myra, you and Graham can think about whether it makes sense to additionally bring in an Americas APAC if you want to kind of cover the third area, and we can stagger those out over the month. So hopefully that will also remove just admin overhead. We can get them set up, we can just get the schedule rolling, and then we don't have to keep planning these things in. So I repurposed the agenda that we had for the previous. There have been a couple of sort of ad hoc calls that have taken place already around self-serve and kind of very much the things that now as orchestration we're thinking of. So I've just repurposed this agenda so that we can keep everything in the same place. But my intention is that we have this as a sort of rolling meeting so that it's not dependent on one particular person. Anyone can be the host, run the meeting, get the recording, and just upload it in the right place. And everyone else can just help with note-taking and like taking actions and things like that. So very much collaborative space for us to use as is useful.
Is there a way to make this live stream instead of recorded so that eventually we just have to, let's say we live stream private and then we just move it to public to remove some admin stuff?
I actually don't know, but it's a good question. Like if someone wants to, I actually have no idea if that's a possibility, but if someone wants to review that, oh my gosh, look at these numbers. That could be, yeah, that could be a great question. So what would be useful for today? Like, what do people want to use this time for? So my suggestion, unless there are any better ones, is just to briefly discuss around EPIC 773, so our analysis issues, not so much as an update, but just as what would be useful. Are there particular bits of information we should discuss right now, or do we know what the next steps are to get the issues through to completion?
Yeah, I do have a question about that epic. I have been working on getting all the details for Italy, and I have put a lot of comments in my issue, and there are some open questions more related to finding granular details. But I'm still not sure about what will be the outcome. I have seen that Matt has been preparing some diagrams, but that should be the outcome for every issue. Should we prepare like a picture of all the processors? Should we document that somewhere? Are we going to do some sort of call with everyone involved? How do we plan to share the knowledge there?
Matt, I'm going to defer to you as DRI here. What would be your sort of like, what are you hoping to kind of end up with from these three issues?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, I guess. So the first thing is definitely on the documentation side of things, having as comprehensive an idea of all the individual steps that these different component teams have to go through for deployments, for releases, for doing security and patches as well. So we sort of end up with, you know, a lot of this written down and ideally sort of created in both sort of a written and a visual medium as well. So it makes it easy for us to reference and sort of help a little bit with people onboarding into delivery in the future as well. Sort of we've got a good point of reference to make it a little, I guess, accessible for people that absorb this information in a couple of different formats. So that's definitely one nice part of this for an outcome. The second part of it is really analyzing what the differences are between all these different components, processes, because like Gitly have their whole thing sort of for themselves, really, which is very, very different to other components. CAS is very different, and then Pages is very different. Like CAS in its own right is, relatively speaking, quite straightforward. There's probably some crossover with what happens with Pages. You know, they all use version files, etc. So what I'm really interested in discovering, by the way, if my AC is too loud, just shout and I'll turn it off. I don't think my headphones are filtering it out. So yeah, so ideally trying to figure out what the differences are between each of those components, with the idea being that if we count for those, we sort of have a better foundation that we can use to build on the idea of exactly what self-serve looks like. Because self-serve might not look identical for every single team out there. We might want to say, like, this is where we want to get to with self-serve, but that might not be completely appropriate or applicable to all component teams if, say, they don't match up with what our definition of what a component should do in order to even sort of hook into these procedures in the first place, if that makes sense. So those are kind of the two outcomes that at least I'm looking at for this epic.
Thanks. I really think we should document that, because as we have seen, the knowledge seems to be spread in everyone's head without like a central piece in which everything is documented. I do worry that documentation might be very exhaustive. For example, for Gitly, I have found out that the process is very long, it's very complicated, and just in my comment is very, very large. And I do have respect for Graham's for reading it all, because it was a lot. So if we were onboarding people and we were saying like, hey, this is a Gitly process, just have a read at it. I'm not sure if that is going to be like, well, a good idea, because it is way too much to absorb in just one set. So perhaps we can think of something else, or another strategy to try to grasp the idea, or something more friendly.
But we also have to consider that this is just documented as is. Doesn't mean, I mean, one of the things that Matt said is that this is about comparing, finding the gaps between the processes, because what I can see looking at those processes, the one that I remember, the one that I don't remember, or that I don't know how they worked, is that they are showing the age of the component. So everyone is really particularly designed around when the component was developed and how it fit into the maturity model of GitLab itself at that point in time. So think about Gitly with strong dependency of ordering in terms of what goes first, what goes after, compared to Pages, which is completely independent and is just lacking a lot of automation. And as well as Gitly being one of the first, or one of the most active developed component, then we try to implement much more automation for them, which in the happy path is perfect because it just gives them kind of master deployment. But on the other hand, it's really hard to understand what is happening, why things are breaking. And even myself reviewing the comment from Graham's, I figured out that we are creating stable branches on RC42, while I was sure that this is not the case. And indeed, there are comments in the code base saying that this is not happening. Indeed, is happening. So this is not great. And company is growing. Many new teams are being added to the product with new ideas for building new components. And we need to find somewhere to point them, say, this is how it should look like if you want to get all the best and goodies that we can provide you.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah, one additional piece around that actually that you make me realize as I listen to all of this is we've got a lot of stuff. It's very complicated. We should document it, but let's also be aware we are about to change the whole thing. So, I mean, maybe not for everyone, Gitly less so, because I think they will follow later, right? I think they're a really useful kind of review component, but I can't see an easy way to change the Gitly deploy, certainly not early. So, I mean, I personally am fine if the issues for now are our documentation, and we get those so that the description reads really well and is easy for us as orchestration to reference. And then we perhaps, as things settle down a bit more, like say, for example, when we changed Kaz's deployment process, as part of that work to do the change, we also give them the documentation they need to understand that piece. So we kind of build it out for them, or something like that might give us some way, I guess, of concluding these issues without having to do a stack of documentation work.
Yeah.
Myra, you mentioned that you had a few questions on specifically on Gitaly. Have you got those answered, or do you want to just go through them in this call?
Yeah, there are some other questions for Graham's when I kind of scanned his latest comments, and he's asking about very specific stuff like where is this comment generated, like what repository is the one that is generating this, and I think I have the answers now.
Okay.
I also interviewed 2 Gitaly team members, and it was useful to understand like their point of view.
Great.
And yeah.
Yeah. Also, we need to think that Gitaly is not it's the perfect example of how we should not do this, because they got forced into the new process. So going forward, we should find sponsorship for teams that are willing to get into something that is better for both of them, instead of just saying this is how we're gonna do. Because it was terrible for us to manage, so we decided to implement some automation for them, but was kind of a one-sided decision.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, this does make me think a bit that, we've got, in this epic, we've got, Gitly, pages, Kaz, and registry. And we sort of haven't paid much attention to registry at the moment. And we've just looked at pages, Kaz, and Gitly. But I'm wondering that because we're interested in differences between the components, maybe Gitly is not a good point of comparison to have as these three, because it is so much more complex. Whereas if we just took Kaz, pages, and registry, they're probably a little bit more easily comparable to each other. Because if, our OKR is for Kaz first and foremost, and admittedly, we've still got a good opportunity in Q3 to prep a lot before we actually get to Q4 and actually do the work itself. So that's right, Amy, isn't it? That we're not specifically working with the team until Q4.
Correct. Yeah. So both the team for Kaz, so configure, and the team for registry package have both requested that we collaborate with them in Q4. That fits with their kind of team scaling plans and their other projects. So we can certainly do stuff, but in terms of actually like us expecting, like us having any chance of moving them as close to self-serve as we can, like, yes, they're not available to work with us.
Yeah. So I wonder if, even though like Myra, the stuff that you've got on Gitly is just really, really good. And it's fantastic to have all that written down. And we need to know all that sort of stuff as well. I think that's the thing, is that even though this documentation is sort of really capturing how things exist at a point in time, and you're right, like it is so much, and particularly being so relatively new to GitLab, I get about halfway through, my eyes glaze over. I get completely lost in the complexity of everything that is going on there. And I agree completely that there is so much there that if somebody was onboarding into delivery and just went, hey, Gitly there, read that stuff, it's impossible to absorb it all in one go. Maybe my proposition would be, we say we're okay with the amount of information that we've collected around Gitly for now. We already have Kaz and we have pages. Graham's doing a much deeper dive into everything that happens specifically with pages when it comes to releases, particularly around the monthly releases, including things that the chat op commands that are running and all the rest of it, going like very, very blow by blow. If we take Kaz and pages, And if we're able to take a look at registry as well, if it, it works out as a relatively straightforward exercise to apply the same processes for CAS and pages to registry, and then use those three components.
No, you might be right. Yeah. No, you're certainly right, Matt. Just as one thing I personally find really interesting about Gitaly is the it's almost the Gitaly experience, like their team's experience. And I think some of it comes from what Alessio was saying about them having been forced in. The other thing is a little bit to do with actually the specifics of how things are set up or where certain alerts go. So I think they're a really interesting use case, just as we start looking at CAS and registry and pages. What are the things that we can take, or other things maybe we can take from Gitaly where we're like, okay, so we need to watch for this. Like, I think we're already hearing a load, like onboarding documentation is really tough. So that feels like a really good problem we should solve, right? Before we go and onboard, I don't know, a heap of developers into deployments, what does documentation need to look like in order to onboard is one, for example, problem. But maybe there are other things that we can see. So I think probably just to give a little bit of Q3 OKR focus, like I think what we need to do in Q3 around CAS and pages in particular, I feel free to all correct me if I'm wrong. My impression from earlier conversations is they're quite well understood, and it's quite straightforward to actually bring them into our existing auto deploy and our existing release processes. But what we perhaps don't have a really good plan for is what happened next. And based on what we know about Gitaly, are there kind of common pieces of work we should focus on, or are there things we can actually do to set those components up? Because like you say, Matt, you're exactly right. The CAS registry pages should all end up being very, very similar. And it'll be interesting if they're not, but it should be, theoretically at least, they should be quite similar.
There is though there are two extra complex items from Gitaly that will be helpful in the conversation for CAS and the other. One is just common to everyone. That is one of the pain point that we realized from this implementation with Gitaly for the development team is that it's really hard for them to track down when the automated component bump is not working. So thinking through this, when we do the other component, this is something we should be aware of. And so this information came from Gitaly. The other information specific to Gitaly, which is important to CAS as well, is that there is a dependency. So both Gitaly and CAS are exposing a Ruby gem as part of their development process that gives Ruby on Rails application access to the gRPC endpoints, so the definition of the services and all the proxy object to do remote calls. Now, Gitaly changed this very often, as by design is an RPC implementation over Git, so they are actively working on that. CAS, as far as I know, talking with one of the main developers, changed it only once in the course of the last year. So they did a good work up front, but they just had to review one of their APIs. So they changed it only once. That being said, this is an extra complexity, but it's extremely important because when we do release management for them, there is a point in time where they may willing to bump the interface without actually releasing the component itself for the broader audience. And what we have done for Gitaly is this. Developers can autonomously declare RCs, so they can tag RCs through automation that we provide. And when we do version bump when we release for them, we are actually also taking care of changing some files that is defining the version of this interface, so that if they want, they can publish the gem that is defining the gRPC interface. either by doing an RC themselves and publishing it to RubyGems, or afterward publishing something that we tagged as, say, 14 dot something.
That's interesting. I think those are almost the pieces which I think will be really, I don't have an idea of how we pull these out. Like, I think it could be super simple. Like, I wonder if maybe there's another issue on this epic, or just something where we start to pull out almost the common things, because it sounds like for something like that, we almost have there is a like gem publishing thing, right? I don't know what the thing is. It may just be a process, a document, or whatever. And then we start to build up. So we have like, okay, CAS is a component that is of this type. They also need the gem publishing thing, and they add it on. Registry isn't that. Registry is this other thing. And we can start to almost, in my head, I've super simplified that down to just like, we have kind of components that we modularly build up to say, okay, this component has this thing. I think Gitly has some that we could reuse. It has some pieces that we wouldn't reuse around its VMs. You know, it's got some complexity. It's got a lot of dependencies on its ordering of deployments and things. But I wonder if there's a way where we actually can start to say, here are the common pieces we can see, and here as the components, these are the common components they are making use of. And I think registry is an interesting one either way, right? So I think very much we can use this one, we can address this one based on capacity. I expect that the configure team will be ready earlier than registry, the package. So CAS will probably be a component that's available for us to collaborate on sooner. I think it's also simpler. So it's kind of got two benefits to it being the component we'd really address first. So I think if we don't get time to do full analysis of registry now, that might also be fine.
There is another thing that came to my mind now that we are discussing. So we are looking at this from the point of view of deploy and releases, but there is an important bit that goes into quality engineering productivity. I don't know who owns those things, which is the test and pipeline at the project level. So, and this goes back with the team of how do we do version bumping and version alignment, because I don't know if we are collecting this in the issues that we are working on right now, but basically some of the components are being built from sources within GitLab pipelines in order to do integration tests with Rails pipelines. Gisely is one of those. Workers, I mean, workers now lives in the same component, so workers in longer component. So pages is not, I don't know if we are I think we're building Elasticsearch indexer, which is another component that we ship, but it's just a binary that gets into the image, but it lives into another repo and it has the same problem about tagging, releasing, and things like that. So my point is that on one side, with looking at what happens at the end of the process, we tag and we deploy, we release and we deploy, but some of those things have problems tied back before then, which is we need to bump ahead of time because we need to run the integration test within the product. And this is central to the problem of self-serve deployment as well. Because if we are moving so this is about build reproducibility on one side, because you have a given commit on GitLab repo, today tells you everything is in there. So maybe something we want to collect as part of this is very simply, is this component being built and tested end to end in the product or not?
would it make sense to try and put together I'm almost thinking this is starting to look a bit like a matrix, right? Where we almost have common, so I'm going to use my highly technical term of pieces. And we try and get a list of what those might look like. Now, it might be we split them up, or if it gets big, we can, but maybe it's like deployments and releases, or maybe it's just deployments and we have a separate one for releases. But we start trying to identify for the components we've looked at, so just for CAS, Gitaly, and Pages, what would be those almost component like building blocks that we're using, and how many of those three components are sharing those processes and how many are using a different one. And I wonder if we could almost then start to build out a table where we have ticks and things just on a separate issue to start to really, because I think what would be so useful is to be able to overlay these three issues that we've got almost and be like, okay, they're like, here's the diff of these three issues, right? Like they're all the same except for these pieces, or some way of actually showing where they start to vary from each other. And what it might even show up is some fairly small things, because I know one thing Graham has mentioned a few times is things like version number format. So it could just be that it simply starts to expose those things where we don't have a great lot of formatting or standardization over pieces of these processes, even if they're largely very similar.
This again opened up another problem, which is not entirely owned by us, which is that we align with version files from distribution.
Exactly. Yeah,
So
and that's fine.
we're just
yeah.
propagating information from one repo to the next one.
That's it. Yeah, and that's absolutely fine. Like I think what I've kind of I think we need to kind of keep clear on these analysis issues is we're not necessarily saying we'll fix everything and change everything. They are very much like, how does it look like? What is the landscape we're working with? And from there, hopefully we can start to pick off what we actually want to go and tackle. So just in the last couple of minutes, right? So I know that there's a heap of stuff. I've tried to put some notes on the agenda so you can reference. I'll get the recording up as well on the playlist in case you want to rewatch. But just as a kind of summary, does it sound like a reasonable thing that we will try? And it sounds like Gitaly we've got almost concluded, and perhaps we just check in on some wrapping up some pieces there, and then try and get to the point where perhaps we use that as a basis for kind of creating another issue on the same epic, which has a kind of, here are the elements of deployment and releasing we're seeing from Gitaly, and can we actually map onto that CAS and Pages? And if not, do we have some extra analysis that we need to do for those two? Cool. Okay. I
just want to leave a comment that I found an old epic that we were working long time ago, which was about how to deploy for components. There is a table there. There are some information. Awesome. So I don't know how much of this is still up to date, but probably it's just reviewing the prior work, and this will help.
Awesome. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I think if we have something like this, perhaps it'll be a little bit more extended with the extra stuff we've got. But I almost think like we could almost link off, right? I wonder if we could almost have something like, where we've got like testing GitLab is just a concept, and publishing gems as a concept, and we could just start building that up, maybe. Cool. Okay. Who wants to take a stab at just loosely starting to pull together that analysis, or setting up an issue, I guess, so that we can start to pull together that overlay of, say, the diffs, almost the diffs of the three components? Okay, not an overwhelming thing. I'll see if I can put together a little bit of a structure. It'll be super high level because I'll try and do it before I head out tomorrow, but I'll just put in a high level, maybe pull in some of the bits that I've been thinking about. We can see then if it looks like it's going to be useful enough to want to expand out to cover the other components. And in the meantime, Matt, would you mind taking an action and just having a figure out and maybe just working with Myra, I assume it's not here, to just see if we can figure out, like, what does the end of the Gitly issue look like? Because I think if we can figure that one out, that was the furthest ahead. That maybe gives us the end of CAS and it gives us the end of pages as well, so that they match up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. I will stick in some more meetings so we have these reoccurring things. Awesome. Thanks. Sorry, Myra. Like, she's probably not around, but that's not good. But I'll stick into reoccurring things and figure out a schedule that also works with Graham. Super. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Take care.
Bye.